Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's fine, having a good weekend. Please let me know that the audio settings are all good so that we can start. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I saw we had a couple of extra followers before I signed in. Hi, Privy and Andy, how are you? I'm glad the audio sounds good. That's great. That means I've gotten good at this and I've fixed my audio problems. Um, okay, so oh, hi, Awadara. Hey, Bernhard, how are you? Well, it's nice to see the usuals popping by. Well, again, if you are new to the channel, essentially what we do here is we have a community of people that gets together once or twice a week, depends on how busy the week is, to discuss international politics and or play video games while doing it. So usually on Sundays we just talk politics, and on Thursdays we play video games. Currently we're playing Baldur's Gate. Oh hey, Magic of Carols, how are you? Um, so I thought I'd start as always. I think you guys know by now how the drill works. There's an ad coming in 3 minutes, so we have about 3 minutes to like discuss housekeeping stuff, get some stuff out of the way. Oh, hi, Kohi. This is your first time chatting, so welcome to our community. Thank you for being here on a Sunday, and thank you for your nice words. I'm very happy that what I do is useful and valuable to you. So yeah, so basically that's the objective of this channel is to be able to offer you guys a glimpse at the um I don't know, the usually hidden away ivory tower of academia in an interactive, live way, and you can ask whatever questions you want. And if it's within my knowledge and area of expertise, then I will answer them. And yeah, the whole idea is for you guys to learn about international law, and for me to learn as well, because like your questions are difficult. So sometimes I just rethink the ways I think so I can answer your questions. Um, and yeah, that is a, a big part of why I'm doing this. Um, so just to get you through the housekeeping stuff, I did want to start by saying that we have started a new playthrough. So on Thursdays at 5, it's always at 5. Um, we are now playing Baldur's Gate. I think it's a game that lends itself for political discussion, so it'll be interesting. And because it's turn-based, like we can just talk, in between turns. That's better. Um, and also that we achieved our follower goal. So we have 320 people here in this channel. So that's amazing. I never thought that I would see 320 people following a international law channel. It is a I guess it's part of the state of the world that we're in. Hey Bernhard, yeah, it's a Baldur's Gate 3. I really love the game, so I'm very excited about playing it. I don't know if we're gonna play the full thing because like that's a lot of hours. But definitely gonna play Act One. Um, Cheese Thief says it asks if this is an international law channel. I know, Cheese Thief. We have had some weird conversations together about international law. Oh, hey, Professor Trakis, how are you? Uh, really happy that you're here. Okay, so in terms of like what is left for housekeeping. As I told you, I am in the process of getting new, and the ad's gonna start, by the way. I'm getting new alerts for the channel. I've already talked to Miyuki, who's the official channel artist. So the channel keeps growing, keeps getting better. As you can see, I keep learning how to improve the interface. I set up over there, a little summary of what I want to discuss. And usually, what we do is I talk for about like I don't know, depends on how long, but usually like 30 minutes, 45 minutes about a specific topic, and then you guys ask around whatever you want, about the topic. And what I thought I'd discuss today, given the state of the world, is Lebanon and what is going on with Lebanon and what does international law say about Lebanon specifically. Um, So, Odara asks if this is a PlayStation game. So it is a PlayStation and computer game. So I have both. So I play on my PlayStation and on the computer because I cannot stream from the computer because my computer is not that powerful. So it's powerful but not that powerful. So I stream it from the PlayStation for you guys. Um, Professor Trakis says that the new Blackboard presentation is very nice. It suits the Sunday episode very well. Thank you. I did it all by myself on MS Paint. So, eventually, as the community keeps growing and more people start subscribing, and like we get more, I get more possibilities to like do investments in the channel. Like for example, I don't know if everyone here knows, but there's channel specific emotes that you can use. They're really fun. And now I'm working on new alerts for the channel. Eventually, I'll be able to afford a more professional layout and do something more interesting with like the layout of the channel. Other than that, like yeah, we're growing as we go. There's 30 seconds left in the ad, so we can start in a minute. But John Steve Paul, hey, how are you? It's your first time chatting, so welcome to the community. And hi, Flip from nowhere. Nice to see you around. Okay, so why did I um frame this episode in this way? Why did I frame this session as Lebanon has a right to defend itself? Okay, that's I would guess that's the clickbaity title for the episode. But there is more than just a clever way of referring to what's going on. Um, and it's because at the heart right now, what we're seeing in international law for the past 24, 23 years, ever since 9/11, um, is let's put it this way, a very frustrating development for me as someone who comes from Latin America and studied international law in Peru, and I was always told by all my professors, lecturers, all of them, that international law is limited in its regulation of the use of force. Like we at the international law arena do not like war because we had World War I, we had World War II, and then everyone sort of like got together and said war is kind of dumb, so let's ban it. And the main object of the UN Charter was precisely to ban war or make it a thing of the past. And so that's how I studied it. That's how I approached international law as a broad prohibition on the use of force in international relations and a uh, narrow exception for some circumstances that warrant states using force in international relations. Okay, that's my approach as someone who learns international law in the global south from a relatively lefty professor in Latin America. Um, and ever since 9/11, we have seen an increased attempt at expanding these like narrow exceptions all over the world, but with one key point in mind, which is it's not expanding the law of self-defense for everyone, but rather it is expanding the law of self-defense to address one specific instance of international relations that mostly affects Western states that have these like expansive foreign policies all over the world and have you know, controversial interests all over the world, and so generate a lot of like resistance by non-state armed groups, even including like terrorist groups that want to attack them. And so the UN Charter, the way the UN Charter is premised, is not designed as a let's regulate terrorism charter. It's designed as a let's regulate war charter. So before 9/11, use of force in the case of terrorism was kind of like a misnomer. Terrorism was a crime that was subjected to criminal law, domestic criminal law, and war was an international um, event, act, right? So it wasn't normalized to go to war over terrorism. There were a few instances here and there where states, intervened in other states, particularly Israel intervening in Lebanon in 1982 to attack the PLO. But that was widely conceived as, yeah, that's not right. That's not how the UN Charter is supposed to work. The UN Charter is supposed to work between states to avoid war between states. Um, and in the general view of that UN Charter, terrorism was seen more like, look, of course, there are terrorist threats that are of global reach, bigger than just criminal law. But in those cases, that's why we will create, said the creators of the UN Charter, a Security Council that is going to um, look into it. And if if the situation so warranted, is able to like issue orders, binding orders for an incremental use of force, right? So under this system, then use of force under international relations was regulated in very simple terms. Step one, it is forbidden to use force in international relations, right? No one can start force because that's an act of aggression, right? You don't solve your problems through war. Number two, to use force in a valid way, you either need the consent of the country in question, um, the authorization from the Security Council, or be acting in self-defense, right? And I'm of course simplifying stuff here, but those are the main three. Um, let's call them prongs to use force in international law, right? So the the clause of self-defense is supposed to be very narrow. It's supposed to be: are you being attacked? Then you have the right to repel that attack. Simple. Are you going to be imminently attacked? Then you have the right to stop that attack. So are the tanks going towards your border? Then you can meet the tanks halfway there. Are you being bombed? Then you have the right to repel the bombing. Are you in the middle of a war? Then yes, you have the right to fight that war. But that's it. Once the threat is over, there is no more right to self-defense. And I know the chat is like populating with questions. I'll get to them in a second. I just want to say what I wanted to say, and then I'll go to the questions. Uh oh, Biscowitch. Hi. I think it's your first time chatting, isn't it? Let me double check that. Uh, here. Yeah, Biscowitch is your first time chatting. Welcome to the community. So essentially, what I was saying is, number one, you either need the consent of the state. So the state says, "Hey, look, I'm fighting. I'm having a problem here. How about you bring troops to my territory?" Okay, that's fine. Number two, you have authorization from the Security Council. You went to the UN, and the UN said, in the Security Council, all the permanent members agreed. Um, no one vetoed the resolution that you can use force. This is the Kuwait scenario. Iraq invades Kuwait. And the UN Security Council says that's not okay. We're going to go in there and we're going to liberate Kuwait. And the third one, sorry, is self-defense, which is the one that I was explaining. Okay, so let me put it this way. For self-defense, you can only use force to stop the attack. Right. So let's put ourselves in the scenario of a state shoots a missile at another state. Right. Let's say Iran shoots ballistic missiles against Israel. Israel, of course, 100% has every right to defend itself against those missiles, meaning that it can shoot down the missiles. It can theoretically also go after the launching pads for those missiles to keep them from launching more missiles. And then there is downward scale, a threshold, if you will, of what things can you do um, that are temporarily separate from the attack. So, can you, once they stop shooting missiles, what else can you do? And there are some theories that are more expansive, there are less expansive interpretations as to how farther away from the attack can you go. But generally, we accept that to be legal, that use of force in self-defense needs to be necessary. So if you're wasting time with your uh, response, there will be a time when your use of force will no longer be necessary to stop any attack because you waited too long, right? So um, in the situation we are in right now, for example, where Iran says, I'm going to shoot missiles into Israel, and Israel then shoots down the missiles, yes, that is self-defense. That is accepted. It would even be accepted for Israel to send a missile to stop the missiles from being launched. That would also be self-defense. But once the attack by Iran stops, Israel does not get a right to then launch its own retaliatory strike against Iran, because that is called a reprisal. And armed reprisals are unlawful under international law. Under the idea that if you design a legal system based on you attacked me, therefore I have the right to attack you, and therefore I have the right to attack you, and therefore I have the right to attack you, you attack, I attack, you attack, I attack, that favors the starting of wars, right? Because eventually that will develop into a war. Whereas if you just say you have a right to defend yourself from attack, and once that attack is done, by all means, come to my Security Council. We'll figure it out. We'll find a way to solve this problem for you. That doesn't favor the starting of war, right? So once the attack is over, you cannot retaliate. Yes, Oadara, retaliation is not self-defense, right? And this applies to Iran and to Israel and to everyone. Retaliation is not self-defense because retaliation is not necessary to stop an imminent or ongoing armed attack. Our use of force under international law needs to be necessary and proportional, meaning that if someone slaps a soldier in the border, you don't get the right to like destroy a city, right? That's disproportionate. It's a different concept of proportionality that done under international humanitarian law, which is, in the course of an armed conflict. Um, but it also this force also needs to be necessary, right? So um, in this scenario where force needs to be necessary and proportional, usually the way the system is designed is a state attacks you. Prong number one, a state attacks you. Prong number two, you have a right of self-defense to stop the attack, and prevent the state from attacking you again. And then that's it. If the war continues, then you keep on getting a right to defend yourself, but you don't get the right to then become an aggressor in revenge. Okay, so that's prong number one. A state attacks you, and you have the right to stop that attack. But then, oh, sorry, Flood from Nowhere says, would they have the right to send missiles into Iran directed at the missile silos or launching places from which Iran sent the initial strikes? So that is what I was saying about there being some disagreement in scholarship as to how long can you take in responding. So in the immediate aftermath of an attack, yes, absolutely, you can send missiles to destroy the missile silos. But the more time passes, the less necessity there is, because you understand that those missile silos are not shooting you anymore, so it's not necessary for you to shoot them to stop them if the hostilities ceased. On the contrary, go to the Security Council and solve it there. But of course, if you ask people that have a more military background, they will extend that period of time for a necessity check longer, right? I'm just not one of them. But of course, like different people, different scholars have different interpretations on this. But all agree that there is some point in time when your retaliatory strike becomes retaliation and not self-defense, right? At some point in time, we can disagree as to how long that is, but not about the fact that at some point your response becomes an illegal reprisal, stops being self-defense. Um, John Steve Fall, give me 1 second and I'll get to your question. Okay, just let me wrap up my idea and then I'll go through the entire chat. Okay, I know you guys are asking a lot of questions, but I think it's important to agree on a set of like agreed upon um agreed upon, let's say, a theoretical framework. Okay, I'll get to all of your questions. We have a long time ahead of us. No worries. Um, so that is how the UN Charter organizes self defense under international law. Okay, um, and then 9/11 happened. Okay, and so Al Qaeda, a non-state armed group, attacked the United States, which has become now sort of like this common thing where global armed states with global reach can attack states, uh, uh, um, other states, right? Um, and one thing was particularly different about 9/11 in that the United States, instead of doing the usual way of doing things, that was, I'm going to apply criminal law to this, I'm going to engage the Security Council, I'm going to exert pressure on the actors involved, I'm going to activate, international cooperation, decided that the better paradigm was war, not law enforcement, but war. And so it engaged the Security Council not to say we need to do something about international terrorism, we need to like strangle their finances, we need to do something about them. No, they went in and said I need to declare war on Afghanistan. And so here the first issue is, as the UN Charter was designed, Afghanistan had not launched the armed attack against the United States. And in fact, Al Qaeda was not acting on behalf of Afghanistan when it carried out 9/11. Right? So this sort of created an issue. Um, hey, Porridge Pistol, welcome to the community. Can you elaborate Article 42 of what exactly? Um, but so okay, so because Afghanistan was not Al Qaeda was not acting on behalf of Afghanistan, we could not say that there had been an armed attack by a state against another state, and therefore the UN Charter was technically not activated. Right? Other mechanisms could be activated, but not specifically the law of self-defense. Right? So the United States faced an uphill battle on this, and so one of the first things that it did is mobilize its entire diplomatic arsenal to let me share an image with you guys. Hold on. Let me remove this and let me put this up. So this here. Oh, what happened? There you go. I don't know if you can. I think you can read that. Hopefully you can read that. Let me see if I can make this bigger. Hopefully you can read this. I think one less. Okay, so that right there is resolution 1368 2001 of the UN Security Council. Okay, it is a resolution approved on September 12th, 2001. Okay, the very next day after 9/11. And one key thing about this resolution is that it posed the debate of, is self-defense triggered, to the Security Council, and this is controversial because like this is not how the UN Charter is works. But given that there was such a level of pressure by the US, something needs to be done, and what I've chosen that needs to be done is war. The phrase self-defense had to be included somewhere in this resolution, and it was included here. I don't know if you can see that I'm highlighting it. Yeah, you can. So it says the Security Council reaffirming the principles and purposes of the United Nations, which, funny enough, includes the peaceful settlement of disputes, um, determined to combat by all means threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist acts, which I would say is not true. Like, not by all means, right? There are means that we should not. This is like kind of the discussion about the right of resistance. Not all means are available. Is the same here, right? Not by all means, but given the atmosphere, this is how this was negotiated. So determined to combat by all means threats to international peace and security. And third, recognizing the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense in accordance with the Charter. This is what started a huge debate about um, what this resolution do in international law. Because usually in an international instrument, like a UN Security Council resolution, there's two different parts of the resolution. You have let me show you the top part here, the one that has the words in italics. You have reaffirming, determined, and recognizing in italics. Those are called the preambulatory clauses. It's the preamble of the resolution. And then you have the number one, two, like over there, one, two, three, four, five. That's the operative clauses. Those are the clauses that decide things. Now, the phrase self-defense is only in the preambulatory section. It's not in this part of the resolution. It's not in the operative, right? It's in the preambulatory. So what exactly did it do? Did it change the UN Charter to say, oh no, from now on, when a non-state actor causes a terrorist attack in your territory, that triggers self-defense against the non-state actor? Or is this just a symbol of solidarity with the United States, saying that yeah, there are circumstances when in the fight against terrorism, self-defense might be triggered under the general rules that when a non-state armed group operates allied with a state, a state, you can attack that state under the standards, the same standards as always. And remember, this was on September 12th, so the very next day. So we didn't have full information yet about Afghanistan's involvement or not non-involvement in 9/11. Right. So what did this resolution do? Right. For me, again, as someone who was trained in international law in Latin America with a strong tradition against intervention, um, this resolution did very little because it says that it recognizes the right of self-defense in accordance with the charter. So it's recognizing something and limiting its recognition to whatever the charter says. So the intent might have been to politically express support for the US's invasion of Afghanistan, which would not come for another month, by the way, speaking of whether self-defense is necessary or not. Or, let me rephrase. So I don't see this as change in international law. But ever since then, we have had a plethora of Western states that have relied on the idea of this resolution to argue that there is such a thing as self-defense against non-state actors in the territory of other states. That the proper mechanism for the scenario of a state having a terrorist group inside of it, not being able to control that group, and that group attacking another state, the proper way to control that scenario is war, not the Security Council, not diplomacy, not security cooperation, right? But war. And this has developed into a standard or proposal to regulate self-defense that in international relations we call the unwilling or unable standard. Under this doctrine, what this doctrine says is that the whenever a state is unwilling or unable to control a terrorist group within its borders, that automatically generates a threat that activates the right to self-defense from a state. So essentially, this is the war on terror logic. If you have a terrorist group within your territory and you are unwilling or unable, according to me, not according to any objective standard, according to me, you're unwilling or unable, I get to bomb that country and to try to get rid of the terrorist group, right? This is the logic of the war on terror. This is what the West came up with in the wake of October of 9/11, right? So here's the problem, though. So Flat from Nowhere says, could we really have talked or negotiated diplomatically with Al Qaeda? Um, I mean, we don't know because we invaded. Well, we know, like the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. But even if we couldn't, the question is the inability to the inability to negotiate with Al Qaeda enough casus belli, enough reason to go to war and do what happened to Afghanistan, and it's still happening to Afghanistan as a result. So just one person out there asks, why are we not bombing Russia? Can you elaborate in what scenario? Um, but okay, so we create the West created this unwilling or unable standard to justify the war on terror. Right? Now, from the perspective of traditional understanding of the law of the UN Charter, this makes very little sense because non-state actors don't usually trigger self-defense. Um, and there's a very good reason for it. There's a very good article that you should read. I'm going to put it, if you don't know, if you're new to the channel, we have a Discord group where I put the stuff that I discuss here in the Discord group, and we have discussions, on off time when I'm not online. So please check my Twitch profile and join the Discord group. Hi, Furwow94. Thanks for following. Welcome to the community. So there is a very good article on this. I'm going to put it here on the screen by a friend of mine, an excellent, amazing scholar, one of the best international legal scholars that I know, um, that essentially explains why this system is not very good. And I put it there in the screen. It says self-defense against self-defense. That is the main problem behind the logic of the unwilling or unable standard, the war on terror that we've created, right? Or that we want to create. Um, I should stop saying we, because it's not we. It's like the global north and western states. Um, I don't want to create this. I think it's a terrible system. So what is the problem? Let's go into that scenario, right? There's a state that has a terrorist group inside. That terrorist group is attacking state B. Like state A has a terrorist group inside. State B has is the victim of the terrorist group's attacks. Um, if um, if the unwilling or unable standard is applicable, state A, the one with the terrorist group inside of it, has nothing to do with the group, with the terrorist group, right? Um, and state B wants to attack only that group. So it claims to act in self-defense. But once it does, that sort of depends on state A, the original state, not having a right of self-defense against state B that is attacking, right? So if we conceive it in the Lebanon-Israel scenario, Israel would have a right of self-defense against Hezbollah only if Lebanon does not have a corresponding right of self-defense against Israel. Because remember, Lebanon has not consented to this. It has not told Israel, hey, you can destroy homes in my own country. So the question that is presented is, why would this not be self-defense for Lebanon against Israel? Right? So you would end up having a clash of purported self-defenses. And since this is not how the charter works, for me this problem doesn't apply, doesn't exist. But generally, we accept that there is no such thing as self-defense against self-defense. If you attack someone without justification, then you don't get a right to claim self-defense. There's a I think I can find the passage here. Um, there's a passage that Adil hints from the ministry's case, which is part of the military tribunal case law here. This little quote here is pretty useful. It says, "He who initiates aggressive war loses the right to claim self-defense against those who seek to enforce the Kelopian Pact prohibiting aggressive war. This was merely the embodiment in international law of a long-established principle of criminal law. There can be no self-defense against self-defense." Right. So let's think about this in the context of Israel and Lebanon. Why does Lebanon not get a right of self-defense against Israel if Israel is attacking Lebanon without cause? Because even if we agree, and I don't agree with this, but even if we agree that Israel is attacking Hezbollah in self-defense, that only applies vis-a-vis Hezbollah, not Lebanon. As far as Lebanon is concerned, this is an act of aggression by Israel. Right? So Lebanon would have a right of self-defense against Israel. And if Lebanon has a right of self-defense against Israel, then Israel cannot be having self-defense against Lebanon, because there can't be any self-defense against self-defense. So you create this hodgepodge of a legal situation, very complicated, where one state would be entitled to self-defense against Hezbollah, but not against Lebanon. And Lebanon would be entitled to self-defense against Israel, of course, but not against Hezbollah. So the only way in which this system would work is if Lebanon never strikes back. Right? And when does this usually happen? Well, it usually happens in the scenario where this standard was purported, the war on terror. How does the war on terror usually work? You have a drone, you shoot a missile, you kill someone. Can Pakistan, does it have the technology to destroy US drones? No. Probably not. Does Yemen? No, probably not. Does Somalia? No, probably not. So this system applies in circumstances where the attacked state cannot actually claim that it is being attacked or cannot do anything about it. So it is a fundamentally unfair standard, right? It is getting um, um, states in the global south, usually orientalized, racialized states in the Middle East, most of all, but not exclusively, that are attacked and then can't or won't defend themselves. So in that scenario, of course, the system works. But when you translate it into a system of, like, it's not a global superpower abusing its power by sending drones halfway across the world, but it is an actual army advancing through Lebanon with troops. How can you say, if we accept that Hezbollah is not acting on behalf of Lebanon, as it does not appear to be the case, even if Hezbollah has connections inside the government of Lebanon, it is not the government of Lebanon, and it is not acting under the control of Lebanon. Even Israel says it's not acting under the control of Lebanon, it's acting under the control of Iran, right? Not Lebanon. So if Lebanon has nothing to do with this, how can you claim that an army steamrolling through its territory does not count as an act of aggression and does not count as self-defense for Lebanon against those advancing troops? It just makes no sense, right? So Lebanon would have a right to defend itself against that army. But in this worldview where, oh no, but we need to defend ourselves against the terrorists at whatever the cost, the absurd conclusion of this unwilling or unable interpretation of the UN Charter, the absolutely absurd conclusion, is that if Israel has a right of self-defense against Hezbollah, and Lebanon, in Lebanese territory, frustrates Israel's self-defense against Hezbollah, then it is Lebanon that would be doing something illegal, because the right to self-defense is inherent, so it's inalienable. So if you prevent someone from defending themselves, you are being the aggressor. So under this mentality, it would be Lebanon that would be the aggressor against Israel when Israel is the one invading Lebanese territory. So when you stop thinking in terms of Hezbollah and you start thinking in terms of Lebanon, this system that we have constructed to operationalize and enable the war on terrorism by the United States doesn't work in normal circumstances. It works when you have a drone that no one can shoot down and you can deploy your force and say, oh, you want to go to war with a world superpower? Well, let's see if you can. But when it's two countries that are engaged in traditional hostilities, the system doesn't account for this. It breaks down. It doesn't make any sense because there is no self-defense against self-defense, as Adil says in the article that I'm showing you there. Right? So this is the main problem here. That we are trying to turn the UN Charter from a document that, oh hey Jens, we're trying to change the UN Charter from a document that bans war broadly and accepts narrow exceptions for the use of force into a document that allows for the Wild West version of international relations, where states can unilaterally declare that other states are not doing enough to control abstract threats, um, or even concrete threats in the case of Hezbollah, and just invade other countries outright. And surprise, surprise, the countries invaded are usually the orientalized, racialized global south states, and the states attacking are the states that employ imperial logics to expand their interests throughout the world. Because while you can tell me that someone asks, "Well, what do we do about Al Qaeda?" Okay, we can we can have a discussion about maybe that. But then it was not just Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, right? It was also then Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. It was Al Qaeda in Iraq, which eventually became ISIS, by the way. It was Al Qaeda in Yemen. It was Al Shabaab in Somalia. It was armed groups in the Sahel. Um, it was a lot of groups that had nothing to do with 9/11. So at one point, the entire system breaks down as this excuse to allow states to use unlimited force, unchecked force wherever outside the bounds of the UN Charter, but by claiming that they are complying with it. That's what I just don't agree with, don't accept. And it's a system that only makes sense when the victim state, when the attacked state cannot fight back. So it is an inherently imperial, inherently almost colonial way of deploying force in the world. Right. Hey, Sonia H25, thank you for subscribing. I appreciate that. That really helps the channel. Um, okay, so let me go through the chat and see what you have been asking, because I know I talked for longer than I normally talk. But I think it's important because I think it's important to set up the argument as to why Lebanon has to have a right to defend itself against Israel under the UN Charter system. And then we can talk about the more complicated stuff about what to do with Hezbollah. What does international law require or allow Israel to do in the face of like rocket attacks by Hezbollah on Israeli territory or Israeli occupied territory? So let me go up the chat. Hold on a second. Um, so wow, you've been talking a lot. Okay. So Professor Trake says the UN Charter was definitely designed to avoid another war. That's true, and respect self-determination. Um. So the three tenants. What else? Yeah. Oadara says so. Retaliation is not self-defense. Yes, that is true. Retaliation is not self-defense. Um. Then for nowhere, I already answered your question. Um. So Oadada says this really illustrates how truly vile the U.S. and its allies have been in constantly proclaiming that Israel has a right to defend itself. They are taking advantage of our ignorance. Well, in the case of Gaza, it is even more complicated because, as the International Court of Justice has stated, Israel continues to deploy um, or continues to have obligations under occupation law. I would argue it's still the occupier of Gaza, but in the wording of the ICJ, it continues to have obligations under the law of occupation. And if you are occupying territory, either you already exercised self-defense because that's how you ended up with the territory, or you exercised an act of aggression, and that's how you're occupying the territory. There's no scenario where you're occupying territory and you're unrelated to self-defense. You either occupied in self-defense or you occupied in aggression. And since the 1967 war, the Six-Day War, was a preemptive strike by Israel, it was arguably, I know people disagree, but at least for me and I think for several other experts, it was unlawful use of force, and therefore it was an act of aggression. And so Israel is already deploying force in Gaza. It cannot therefore claim that it can use self defense against occupied territory because to be occupying, you either already deployed force in self defense or you are the aggressor. And if you are the aggressor, like the text over there says, you cannot claim self defense. Right? So if Israel is the aggressor, you cannot claim self defense. Um, and if Israel would be acting in self defense, it already deployed force. So under the law of occupation, the people under occupation are the ones who have a right to oppose the occupation. Of course, they don't have the right to commit war crimes and to commit October the 7th. Um, but that breaks the rationale of self defense under the law of occupation. So both for there are caveats both for Lebanon and for Gaza about this right of self defense. And the main problem remains that we are framing counterterrorism in the exclusive domain of war, where the UN Charter concluded that the the ones that handled terrorism were the Security Council. Yeah, the Security Council is broken. Okay, the Security Council is broken. It doesn't work. Okay, it doesn't work. It's too difficult to reform. Okay, it's too difficult to reform. But you know what? Sovereignty isn't broken, and it is also very difficult to reform. So why is it that what you're saying is that it, the chain of what isn't working should break on global South sovereignty? It is global South states, the weaker side, who should give up protections against use of force and invasion, not the world superpowers that have a right to veto in the Security Council, who should give up those privileges so that we can have a functioning international law. You see where I'm going with this? Yes, there is a problem with non-state actors in international law. We need to do something about it. What the UN Charter prescribes is that the UN Security Council should act. The UN Security Council cannot act because the members of the permanent members of the Security Council veto collective action. Either the US or Russia or China, they all veto whatever goes against their interests. And the solution to that, you're telling me, is well, we should reform international law so that Israel can invade Lebanon? Why? Why is global South sovereignty the one that needs to be watered down to allow more war in our world, um, so that more global South states can be attacked and invaded instead of giving up privileges at the Security Council? Why is it that we conceive global South states having to surrender protections as easier than global superpowers surrendering privileges? Why? Why should the global South accept that deal? It makes no sense. So why should we water down self-defense instead of reforming the Security Council? Why is that easier than reforming the Security Council? And as long as the answer to that is because I want to keep my privileges and I want to keep my veto power, then honestly, the Global South has no obligation to accept that. It's a deal that the Global South does not need to take. The Global South can keep on saying, no, we want self-defense to stay as it is. We want to keep our protections. You give up your privileges. And I can't fault the Global South for doing that, because it is the Global South that will be invaded, and the Global South where 40,000 people will die, or 1 million people will be starved, or 1.2 million people be displaced. It won't be the United States, it won't be Russia, it won't be China, it won't be France. It will be the Global South. So they should get to object to this. Um, let me continue. Let's see. So John Steve Paul says, so by your logic, Israel does not have a right to respond to the October 7th attack once the initial attack was over. So let me put it this way: there are things that Israel can do legally under international law to protect its population from an attack like October 7th. It is just not premised on the law of self-defense under international law. So under international law, Israel not only has the right, it actually has the duty, the obligation to protect its population from an attack like October 7th. It's not a right, it's not a prerogative, it's a duty. Israel has to protect its population from October the 7th, or from, indiscriminate rocket fire launched by Hezbollah. If there's a state that would say, "Oh, I actually don't care. You can just come in and ravage and rampage in my territory," that would be a human rights violation by that state. So Israel had absolutely every right to protect its population in October 7th, and keep the people who came into its territory at bay. Absolutely, through force. Yes, I do not think that Israel had the right to issue a blanket order saying that its troops could just target, hostages before they got to Gaza. I think the legal rationale um, to doing that would be international humanitarian law that would require a proportionality and a distinction check to be done before that, and say the military objective obtained by attacking the Hamas people that have a hostage would be more valuable than the loss of a hostage. That scenario might exist, but this blanket order of saying, no, if you see people that are being taken to Gaza, just shoot them. That's a human rights violation. That's illegal, right? So within that caveat, yes, Israel had every right to protect its population on October 7th. There is an argument. There are scholars who make the argument that Israel could have even, or not Israel, because Israel was occupying Gaza, but that you can rely on counted exceptions, like for example the necessity exception, to use force cross boundary in a situation of imminent attack. So let's say that a state discovers that an armed group is marching towards its border to attack that state. Then there's an argument that yes, you could theoretically violate the sovereignty of, say, Lebanon, to attack an armed group that's going to attack you before they attack you. So you would be recognizing that what you're doing is illegal, but you would be saying, I have a valid excuse, the excuse of necessity. And that's it. After that, international law, under the law of self-defense, does not really allow much, because Israel is occupying Gaza. So Israel, as long as Israel is occupying Gaza, as the occupying power, it has the vicarious duty to protect the population of Gaza, and so it cannot just launch a retaliatory attack like that. It just doesn't. It can exercise the oversight of Gaza to try to identify who are the culprits behind October the 7th. But it cannot just launch a year-long operation to destroy um, the entire city. Because if you are occupying territory, if you are occupying territory that isn't yours, then your obligation is to maintain that territory for the population you are occupying it against, while you are doing so. Like, if you occupy land, you cannot destroy it. You're occupying it. You're holding it in place under presumably an obligation of self-defense, um, and you cannot just destroy it. You are responsible for the people that you are occupying, essentially. So yeah, you cannot just destroy it. You can deploy um, security mechanisms to protect the population and to, like, chase down Hamas, but you cannot destroy Gaza in response. Um, so there are things that international law allows you to do, but just destroying Gaza is not one of them. Um, so I see several people answered to um John Steve Paul. Um, so John Steve Paul says, so by this logic they can the answer is not kind of, but no. They can repel, stop the attack, but not send one missile away into Gaza. I mean, well, why? I still don't see why you need to send a missile into Gaza in response to October the 7th, if your objective is to stop October the 7th, and October the 7th was happening in Israeli territory. Once that is over, then yes, there are stuff that you can do, but it doesn't need to be within the framework of war. Um, Especially when you're the occupying power, right? But even if you were to assume that you can launch one missile, that's not what happened. It wasn't one missile. Let me see. Let me keep on going down. Um, so so just one person out there says, if we can attack armed groups and terrorist groups, isn't Russia considered one? No, Russia is a state, so it's not neither an armed group or a terrorist group. It is a state, so different. Um, oh, thanks for sharing the Discord, Boulevard of Dreams. Um, so Flat from Nowhere says, how could then Israel exercise its right of self-defense vis-a-vis Hezbollah without carrying out actions that are tantamount to a war of aggression against Lebanon? Okay, so this is um a good question. Um, so I think we need to move past this idea that Israel didn't do anything immediately after October 7th in Lebanon. Like, let's be honest, by July 2024, 95 Lebanese people had died and 95,000 Lebanese people had been displaced. More Lebanese people were displaced than Israelis, right? So it's not a scenario where Israel was doing nothing and then all of a sudden decided to act. In terms of the international law applicable here, I would question, why is it that those 95,000 Lebanese people now turned into 1.2 million Lebanese people that are being displaced count less than the 80,000 Israelis that were displaced? Because that's what you're telling me, right? You're telling me that we had to displace 1.2 million people because there were 80,000 Israelis. Why don't they count the same is my question. Now there's, like, I think, like 3,000 dead in Lebanon alone. So why do they count less is my question. And if they count the same, then why can't we conceive of mechanisms that do not involve a ground assault of Lebanon like this? Like, what under what excuse does Lebanon not have a right to territorial integrity? I don't get it. So what can you do in the face of Hezbollah launching rockets? Well, I mean, first of all, you have absolutely every right. Israel has every right to intercept those missiles. Arguably, under the law of necessity, if you actually see someone shooting missiles at you, you can theoretically violate Lebanese sovereignty to prevent that missile from being attacked. But then when you start looking at this from the perspective of the overall problem, why is this happening? Why is it that we always hear there was a quote unquote ceasefire on October 6th? Because there is such a thing as de-escalation that does not involve escalation. So there was a status quo that, sure, it wasn't absolutely peaceful. There were still problems. Like in March 2023, April 2023, Hezbollah launched 24 missiles against Israel. And before that, Israel occupied a town in Lebanon and has occupied it since. So it wasn't perfect, but it wasn't what we have now. People were able to live in northern Lebanon. So what happened? What changed? Right? And what changed is that after October the 7th, the massive response, military response in Gaza that everyone knew from day one that was coming. Like no one was caught by surprise by the fact that thousands of people started dying as a response. Like in Israel's retaliation, in Israel's like counterattack, let's say. Um, um, that generated a breaking of the entire region. The entire region like unraveled, right? Because the main point of content here is that the original illegal act is the occupation of Palestinian territory. So, what does international law ask you to do? And I talked about this in my previous video. What was the one thing that you could do that could de escalate this whole thing from the beginning? End the occupation. That, that's, that's it. It's as simple as that. End the occupation, engage with the Palestinian Authority, engage with Jordan, engage with Egypt, engage with Turkey, engage with the Gulf states, with all the actors that are in friendly terms with Israel, that are not attacking Israel, and that are partners for peace, that Israel systematically ignores because it prefers to attack Gaza and it prefers to attack Lebanon and Hezbollah instead of like focusing on the violent actors instead of looking at the peaceful actors. So for me, the main thing that international law permitted Israel to do is end the occupation, announce the start of a new um, approach to the region, and engage with peaceful actors to generate a new status quo where it can protect its borders and where it does not need to have an armed group shooting missiles at its borders. And you say, oh, but they would still launch missiles because the reason is not the occupation. The reason is that they hate us. Well, at the very least, you're calling their bluff and you're removing legitimacy from them and giving legitimacy to the peaceful actors. So it sounds more strategic to me than just this. If someone had told me, you know what the plan is? The plan to deal with October 7th is to launch an attack on Gaza so that then 80,000 Israelis are displaced, and then Iran conducts a ballistic bombardment of Tel Aviv, and then we start, destroying our economy because we're spending too much money on war, and this is awesome, no one would have believed you. The original plan was to exert such a pummeling of Gaza that Hamas would surrender, and that Hezbollah would be scared, and that the so-called axis of resistance would have crumpled down in the face of overwhelming Israeli action. That didn't happen. That strategy is failing. So why continue with the failing strategy? Okay, let me continue. Um, So Flip from Nowhere says, if after destroying Hezbollah, Israel withdraws entirely from Lebanon and compensates fairly the Lebanese people for the destruction and damages they caused during their campaign, could that be in legal terms interpreted as a legitimate exercise of the right of self-defense? I don't think so, because of what I've explained. I don't think that um, Israel has a right to self-defense against non-state actors operating out of Lebanon. Um, and I'm not sure you can properly compensate what's happening at some point, you know. Um, Bisco, which says, didn't the ICJ rule that other countries need to make international law stop the genocide? Sure, but through legal means. And unilateral use of force is not legal. Um, Chirimbolo says, what does the law do to help countries like Lebanon, whose military doesn't have the capacity to defend the country? Hezbollah does, but not the official army. Well, I mean, but again, so here there is a United Nations peacekeeping force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, that is unable to act because it does not receive the resources that it needs to act. International law has created that force. It's there. It operates, but it doesn't have the power to do much. So instead of like launching unilateral actions, we do have collective mechanisms through the UN. Um, And let's not forget the reason why Hezbollah exists is one of these like missions that Israel took upon itself to sort of like fix the Middle East through war and teach, at that time the PLO, another armed group, a lesson by going into Lebanon and trying to destroy the PLO in Lebanon. The result was Hezbollah. So this is a constant policy of Israel seeking to attain absolute security for a project of colonization of Palestinian territory at any cost. And so it's not working. This idea that eventually, like, there's two tenets of Israeli strategic thinking that just are not working. Number one is deterrence. One of the main arguments that Israel has in terms of strategic thinking is if you do one to me, I will do 100 in response. And you should know that I will do 100 in response. The so-called Tahiyya doctrine, right? That clearly is not working because Israel continues to launch invasions of Lebanon, then attacking Gaza every few years, moloing, this idea of going into Gaza every now and then. It kills a lot of people in the West Bank. It subjects Palestinians to apartheid and to racial segregation in the West Bank. It is occupying Syria, and yet its problems continue. So deterrence is not really working. And the second one is strategic, what they call strategic depth. So they need more land, so because Israel is too thin. So in the case of an invasion or launching missiles, not enough time. There's not enough time to repel invasions. So they need to conquer land, and that's why the settlements exist. So in the search for maintaining this project of attaining strategic depth and increasing the borders of Israel, they are seeding planting the seeds of future problems. In trying to quote unquote teach the PLO a lesson, they created Hezbollah. In trying to teach Palestinians a lesson, they created Hamas. In trying to teach Hezbollah a lesson now, they might create something worse because force is a very bad way of solving problems. There's a reason why the UN Charter bans it. So I'm I don't understand. Um, So just one person out there. I think I already answered your question, so I'm gonna skip it. Um, Bisco, which says, how is it legal to keep people in an open prison under siege? I don't think the occupation of Gaza is legal. I think the ICJ has made it very clear. Um, so John Steve Paul says, but you were saying before that after the initial attack is repelled, any response to that is a reprisal and therefore not allowed. So how could Israel have any right to a response? So again, under the system as it exists now, Israel is occupying Gaza. So Israel already has a big security apparatus around Gaza. Israel can either comply with its obligations under occupation law and work towards the you know um, you know sending like maintaining the safety and well-being of the population, or it can end its occupation. And of course, no one is saying end the occupation tomorrow, um, but it is a better alternative to launching these like lessons against groups that end up you end up in a ballistic bombardment of Tel Aviv. I really don't see why you think, John Steve Paul, that um, launching a full-scale bombardment of Gaza has helped in any way in making Israel safer. Like, Hamas is an armed group that operates in the territory of a state called Palestine, ruled by the Palestinian Authority with a government in Ramallah. Why has it never occurred to Israel to engage the Palestinian Authority and say, look, we know you want me to recognize your statehood. I have a problem in Gaza and a security problem in Gaza. Let's work together towards ending the occupation so that that problem is no longer a problem. Let's collaborate. Let's set up the terms for a new Middle East. And I will recognize the Palestinian state. And then maybe in the course of that negotiation, you can even accept limited, reduced, narrow uses of force with the consent of the state in certain circumstances. Um, they never considered this because they cannot even fathom strengthening Palestine, because Palestine needs to be strategic depth. It needs to be land to be acquired so that Israel can better protect itself and gain more territory. But it really is silly to have a peaceful partner there and to focus instead on more war, as if that's going to solve anything. An eye for an eye makes everyone blind, right? So at some point, you need to negotiate with the Palestinian Authority and say, you know what? Yes, I'm going to give up this silly idea that I have any rights to land in the West Bank, and let's agree to a process through which we can understand each other and address the problem of um, Gaza. That 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 never occurred to anyone. Of course it did. It's just not a politically viable solution for a government that wants to acquire territory in the area where the Palestinian Authority currently operates. Um, so John Steve Paul says your logic is that it is occupying Gaza, but what if it wasn't? Then again, I still don't see why war is the answer to this. I honestly don't see why we need to follow this like 9/11 scenario where we keep invading countries pretending that that makes us safer, and we turned the Mujahideen into Al Qaeda. We turned Al Qaeda into ISIS. Um, we keep creating more and more threats because we keep thinking that the solution to the world is war, and it isn't. Um, John Steve Paul says doesn't make any sense that one can fire many rockets at a country, and once the attack is over, the country that was fired on cannot retaliate in any way. I mean, it can prevent the attack, right? But once the attack, either you are at war and you're going to have reciprocal attacks at all times, and therefore you're at war, and so therefore this discussion breaks down, or you are engaging in a set of retaliatory attacks, one against the other. Um, the idea that you can just take up revenge isn't legal, isn't something that the law allows. Because what the law wants is to avoid situations of war. Simple as that. Um, I don't get why you see this from the perspective of Israel only. So what Iran did in Iran's terms, without justifying this, okay, because I do believe that it was an unlawful reprisal as well. What Iran says is Israel targeted my consulate in Damascus and targeted an ally of mine in my own territory. And I can read your text verbatim and say it doesn't make any sense that one can fire many rockets at a country. You just replace that for it doesn't make any sense that one can attack an ally in my territory with a missile and also attack my consulate in Damascus. And once the attack is over, the country that was fired on cannot retaliate in any way. Your argument, John Steve Paul, is a legal defense of Iran's ballistic bombardment of Tel Aviv. Why do you want that? I don't understand. Unless you want to argue that that was legal, and therefore you also have that legal right to retaliate. I don't understand why you are making Iran's case for it. Um, so Biskowitz is talking about applying the framework of settler colonialism to Israel Palestine, and I mean I agree that that is the correct framework. But in the course of anti-colonial resistance, um, that is also subjected to rules, and those rules are essentially as per the UN Charter, as per the UN General Assembly. The UN General Assembly decided that resistance of anti-colonial resistance has to be carried out through quote all available means, meaning that some means are prohibited. So not all means are allowed. One mean that isn't allowed is an indiscriminate attack, because an indiscriminate attack is a war crime. Right. So if you shoot a bunch of missiles at territory inhabited by civilians without taking care of where those missiles are going to land, you are not discriminating between the military targets that you are entitled to resist and the civilian targets that you are obligated to protect. So I don't think incorporating the colonial framework here justifies war crimes. I just don't think that. Well, you can disagree with me if you want, but I agree with the standard that anti-colonial resistance needs to happen through um, any available means, not through any means necessary. John Steve Paul says your logic is bizarre. The Allies destroyed the Nazis. Does that mean the Nazis were correct, or the Allies were the aggressor? This is in response to you saying that 1 million displaced Lebanese is more wrong than 60,000 Israelis. I did not say that 1 million displaced Lebanese is more wrong than 60,000 Israeli displaced. I never said that. I said, why is it that you don't count them? Why is it that to you that doesn't factor in? I what I said is, why aren't they equal? Why isn't why is it that to protect 60,000 Israeli displaced people, you are okay with displacing 1.2 million Lebanese? Shouldn't you be against internal displacement in general? So, as to your comparison to the Nazis, I personally don't like making comparisons to the Nazis in this kind of like topic, because I feel it's insensitive to people that uh, have particularly Jewish people that have a history with the Nazis. But since you're making um, the comparison and you're bringing about their actions, I will make an exception. Um, First of all, I don't think it's the same to compare the actions of the German state in 1939 to armed groups that operate within the territory of other states. Um, because Hezbollah is not launching a blitzkrieg against Poland. It just isn't. That is a fact. So the discussion sort of breaks down when you have a open war um, of one against the other, right? When you have tanks invading Poland, there's no end of the attack. The attack continues. And once the Nazis invaded France, France, allied with the UK, invoked. Okay. I should clarify one thing. None of this applies under the UN Charter, because World War II was before the UN Charter. So most of these examples that incorporate the Nazis are anachronistic, because you cannot really use the UN Charter framework to a war that happened before the UN Charter. Okay, but let me try and translate the terms of the UN Charter so that we can understand it in those terms. Let's assume that the UN Charter applied to World War II. Okay, to address your point, John Steve Paul. So in the case of Poland, that's very simple. It wasn't a missile and done. It was a blitzkrieg of hundreds and hundreds of tanks advancing on Poland. There was no moment where the attack ended, to the point where the entirety of Poland was occupied. So when did the attack end? Never. It ended when the last tank left Poland, when the last Nazi left Poland. Actually, the last German soldier, Nazi or not Nazi, left Poland. That's when the attack ended, right? Before that, it was a continuous armed attack. And so, of course, you could defend against that attack. The attack never ended. And then, when Germany invaded France, in the context of today's law, this is not, again, not what happened because this example is anachronistic. But if I translate it to modern parlance, France invoked the assistance of the UK to protect it against German aggression. That, in today's terms, is known as the doctrine of collective self defense. And since Germany was occupying France, the attack was again continuous. There was no moment where the Nazis said, okay, you know what, we're done. We're going to go back to Germany and we're going to sit there for a while and don't attack us, okay? Because, like, we're done. World War II is done. We're going to go back to Germany and that's it. That never happened. There was no ceasefire, before 1939. Before during World War II, that didn't happen, right? So the Germans were occupying France, so that is a continuous attack. So of course, the UK, acting in self-defense of France, can continue to try and defend France. The attack never ended. That is not the same as what's going on with Hezbollah, because Hezbollah, say it with me, has nothing to do with interstate war and is nothing like what happened in World War II. So these comparisons are not just anachronistic, they're not just insensitive to people that have a history with the Holocaust and with World War II. They are also very different and very bad examples. So no, of course the Allies were not the aggressor. Germany was the aggressor. They occupied another country and stayed there, and so other states had to repel it. So when you think about it, in this scenario that you are posing here of the Germans occupying France and that being a continuous attack, if you agree with me that the Six-Day War was an unlawful use of force, and through the Six-Day War, Israel ended up occupying the West Bank and Gaza unlawfully, as the ICJ has recently said, then I'm sorry to say, but in your example, the continuous attack is Israel's. I mean, Israel is the one in your example that would be occupying another country and staying there, maintaining an armed attack over 75 years, for over 75 years. So it's a bad comparison. And it's a bad comparison because you end up making the point that I just made. I don't want to make that point. I don't want to make that comparison. But you're forcing me by bringing the Nazis into discussion. I don't like making those comparisons. It's insensitive. So let's avoid that. I saw Professor Trakis left. Um, sorry, I get mad with this because I really don't like the Nazi arguments. I don't like comparing everything to the Nazis. Um, let me see who else is talking here. So it's Chirumbolo167 says, it seems the only way for a global South country which cannot defend itself against aggression is to appeal directly to the favor of one of the countries in the Security Council, which is silly, right? That's one of the problems with the system as it exists right now. John Steve Paul says again, you make it seem like Israel ends the occupation and it is all better. I want peace and a two-state solution, but they left Gaza, and the only reason the blockade exists is because of Hamas. So saying ending the occupation is the only thing in the way of peace is ignoring the evidence in your own eyes and ears. No, it isn't, because the occupation didn't end. Like, you cannot tell me that you ended the occupation when Israel is still in the West Bank and it still maintains control over most stuff in Gaza. I mean, that's not me saying it. That's the International Court of Justice saying it. I don't understand. The occupation has never ended in Palestine. Um. So John Steve Paul says the Pals. Oh, please don't say Pals. Just say the Palestinians have also rejected a solution that would involve ending the occupation twice. Again, no, they haven't, because it's not ending the occupation if Israel gets to keep even an inch of Palestinian territory. They don't need to accept that. The dispute between Israel and Palestine is a dispute for the entirety of the mandate of Palestine. Palestine already conceded to 80% of the territory staying in Israeli hands. Why would they accept even further territorial concessions? So those deals were, if you're a Palestinian, those deals were very unfair. That from nowhere says basic rookie question: if the ICC issues arrest warrants on charges of genocide and other international crimes, how can they enforce those orders? Like, what is the coercive institution that would carry out the warrants? Well, domestic law, right? Each police force around the world would need to enforce them. Um, Idiot Drone says, I think it's your first time chatting. Let me double check that, but I think it is. Idiot Drone, yeah, it is your first time chatting. Welcome to the community. You say, is it possible that nobody is actually full on the right side, but it comes down to all the leaders wanting to stay in power, and the war basically serves all, both Netanyahu and Arab leaders? I mean, I don't know. I I um I don't know if the war is helpful to Arab leaders. I I don't think the war is helpful to anyone really. Maybe individually for specific people, like Netanyahu certainly benefits because he gets to stay in power. Um, but the world is rarely black and white. There are objective things that happen. Like I think the situation with Palestine is fundamentally unfair, and I don't think you can convince me otherwise. Um, but by all means, all sides. There's something that Ta-Nehisi Coates said um, that I thought it was very illustrative. I don't care what you tell me that Palestinian groups have done. It still doesn't justify apartheid. It just doesn't. Two wrongs don't make a right. Um, Let me see who else. Uh, Mongolia just let Putin come. Yeah, it really does depend on each police force, like I said. Who else? Let me see. Uh, so Flat from Nowhere says, I looked it up and Israel is not an ICC member state. What would upholding the warrants look like in practice? Like, what does that mean? ICC member states are authorized under international law to send troops into Israel if their sole purpose is to execute the warrants. So no, Israel is not a member of the ICC, but Israel is operating in the territory of a state that is a member of the ICC, i.e., Palestine. And so, usually what I would tell you is there's not much you can do if those people are in Israel, and that's it. The particularity of the Israeli Defense Forces is that many soldiers in the Israeli Defense Forces have double nationality. Um, and that is a relevant factor because then their home states can actually prosecute them at home. Um, Idiot Drone says, didn't the UN conclude that both Israel and Hamas committed war crimes? Oh, absolutely. Hamas has committed a lot of war crimes. War crimes that should be condemned, actually. Like I said, I don't believe in any means necessary. I believe in any means, any available means. And war crimes are not an available mean to anyone. I don't think war crimes advance the cause of decolonization. So yeah, both Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah have committed war crimes. I think that's just a statement of fact. Let me see. Chief Steve asks, which Palestinian Authority, the civil government or Hamas? This is an interesting point because everyone wants to say that Hamas is the government of Gaza, and that's just misleading. Hamas is an armed group that controls a portion of Palestinian territory, whose government is the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. Um, It is not the government of Gaza because we don't grant Hamas recognition as anything under, like, at least the international community doesn't. There was a civil war between Fatah and Hamas, and Hamas ended up in Gaza. But the one that ended up with effective control of most of the territory and the recognition of the international community is the Fatah government in Ramallah. So that is, under the rules of of government recognition, the likeliest candidate to be the international government of the state of Palestine. If let's put it this way: when the Confederates seceded from the United States, that did not mean that the Confederates were the government of the South. They were the seceding governments of the South, but they were the seceding governments. No one needed to recognize them as any kind of official authority, to the point that no one did. At most, what they did was recognize them belligerent rights, not uh, you know, formal rights as government. So when people say that Hamas is the government of Gaza, it's very misleading because it is meant to again weaken the Palestinian Authority, the peaceful partner that has not engaged in war, to divide Palestinians. And that's just not true. The government of Gaza is still the government in Ramallah. It is just that that portion of Palestinian territory is not under the control, not under the effective control of the Palestinian Authority. But that doesn't turn Palestine into two different countries, the West Bank and Gaza, one ruled by the Palestinian Authority, one ruled by Hamas. That's just not how it works. Um, the West Bank and Gaza are one single territory. They're unified under international law. Um, Idiot Drone says, after 10 minutes, my question was read. I am wondering to follow up or not and wait another 10 minutes. I'm so sorry. I go as fast as I can, but it's complicated topics. Um, Idiot Drone says, so Odara says he used the great example of the death penalty. Can you expand on that? What did I say? um, Idiotron says, actually, I wonder what exactly is Gaza if it is not a country and not part of Israel. What is its status? The equivalent to that question is for the let's say in terms of the United States, because I know most of you guys are in the United States. The question you are asking is, what exactly is Florida? That's what you're asking. Florida is a part of the United States. Okay. If tomorrow uh, an armed group takes control of the capital in is it, I think, the capital of Tallahassee? Well, I don't know. Takes control of the capital of Florida and establishes the I don't know, the government of Florida. Does that make Florida a separate country from the United States? No, right? Not even under local domestic law, not under international law. Same with Hamas and Gaza. It's exactly the same thing. If you don't have a problem with saying that just because some dude puts a flag on top of the Capitol Hill in Florida, you don't have any problem with saying, but that's still U.S. territory, it's the same with Gaza. It's very simple. Biskowicz says, is it even possible to not commit war crimes against a genocidal settler colony, which is allowed to commit war crimes with near total impunity? So I would counter this, Biskowicz, with um, I don't think I sort of see your point in saying that it is almost impossible to fight a war where no war crimes are committed, even if, like, you want to not commit war crimes. Like, there's the famous history of the armed wing of the ANC in South Africa, arguing that they would not target any women or children in their hostilities. But they did detonate a bomb in front of a cafe where soldiers were South African soldiers used to go there. So they had made their own declaration of compliance with international humanitarian law, and yet they interpreted it in such a way that they committed an attack where I would argue they committed a war crime. So they didn't want to commit a war crime, but they committed a war crime, in my opinion, at least. So I guess I see where you're going with this, but I would counter. Uh, it's possible to take precautions to not commit war crimes. Precautions that simply stated Hamas and Hezbollah don't engage in. So um, I think there are many groups throughout history that have fought anti-colonial wars, making concrete efforts to fight um, without committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. Um, Even groups that committed war crimes themselves. Like I think in Algeria there was a declaration of to comply with Additional Protocol One. Like I said, the ANC. There's many groups that have said, I will try to comply with international law, and I think that's the correct way to fight a war. I don't think that civilians need to pay the price for war. So yeah, I guess my question would be there's there's a difference between not wanting to commit a war crime and wanting to commit a war crime. Kung Fu Kenny, I think it's your first time chatting here. Let me double check that. Uh, yeah, it's your first time chatting. Welcome to the community. So Kung Fu Kenny says, is it fair to state that Israel has defaulted on the rights of Palestinians, especially Palestinians with disabilities, given Israel's obligations under IHL and the CPRD? Thanks. I don't have sufficient information to properly answer your question because I'm not aware of the details of Palestinians with disabilities. But given the reality of Gaza, I think so. Yeah. I mean, assuming Israel has um, so you're asking about Palestinians with disabilities. I generally yes, because they destroyed hospitals and even before October 7th, they had Gaza under blockade. So I would argue yes. Um, I don't think they're upholding their rights under the Convention for the Rights of Peoples with Disabilities. Um, Idiot Drone says, is Hamas in any way official for Palestine? Does anybody recognize it? No. No one recognizes it. I don't think even like Iran recognizes Hamas as the government of Palestine. But I'm not entirely sure about that. Um, Chief Steve says Florida is part of territory unjustly taken away from Spain. Actually, um, so Oadara says, when you mention Ta-Nehisi codes, he uses the death penalty example to illustrate that no matter what Palestinians may have done, apartheid is still wrong. Yeah, I agree. It's a good point as well. Yeah, I think what Ta-Nehisi codes is doing is great. Chief Steve says it really is baffling how the most staunch Zionist just needs to spend the week in Israel before they backpedal and renounce their views. I wish that were true. I'm not so sure. Biskowicz says the Algerians use bombs in cafes. Yeah, there's different there's different moments in the Algerian Revolution as well. Uh, I'm not saying Biskowicz that the walk of no return would have worked. I'm not saying violence is not an option. I do believe in violent struggle against colonial domination. I think that is a part of international law. I think there's nothing in international law banning it. On the contrary, it is allowed. I don't think anti-colonial struggle requires war crimes. That's our only disagreement, is that you believe that it is legal to commit war crimes, that is to kill civilians as part of anti-colonial resistance. And what I'm saying is no, it is not legal. You can even tell me that you think it's moral. We would disagree there as well, but you can tell me that it is more. But where I think it is objectively false is when you say that it is lawful. I don't think it's lawful. Um, so Idiot Drone says, I really wonder if there is any part of Palestine that is not under occupation. No, Palestine is all under occupation, and some portions of that occupation have actually been annexed by Israel, so it's even worse. Biskowicz says, I don't believe that it is legal. I believe that they don't have another choice. Well, if that is your view, then choices, right? If you, I would counter that and say that they do have a choice because many other groups throughout history have had that choice and have made declarations under Additional Protocol 1 to say that they will respect the laws of war. But let's assume that you are right and that um, they. Uh, I do think they have a choice. Many other groups have actually made statements like this that they will try to not harm civilians. And sure, we can have a disagreement as to whether they can comply with it or not in practice, but that doesn't mean that like again, there's a difference between taking precautions not to harm civilians and coming off short and not taking precautions. There's a difference there. So we can have a discussion about that, but I don't think that I choose to not take any precautions for civilians. That's a choice. That's not something forced upon you. You can always take precautions to not harm civilians. That's something that only you can do. Magic of Carol says the occupation is the problem. I agree. The occupation is the problem. I think most of the things that are happening right now have at their root the occupation. I think ending the occupation is not only the legal thing to do, it is also the thing that would keep Israelis most safe. Because this project that Israel has of investing all of their resources in protecting a colonial apartheid regime against Palestinians is um, creating more and more enemies in the region. It is making Israelis less safe. And at the end of the day, it is only making Israel dig itself further and further into a hole, and then saying, "Why am I in a hole?" Um, so Idiot Drone asks if we think that Hamas and the PLO are doing everything perfect. No, I don't. Um, Changebox. I think it's your first time chatting with us. Changebox, is it? Yeah, it's your first time chatting. Welcome. Um, Speaking of the prompt, Lebanon has a right to defend itself. Please define defend. This is the most critical aspect of the prompt. So essentially, can Lebanon stop the Israeli advance in Lebanon? Can Lebanon shoot down Israeli planes? That's basically it. And I think it under international law, there's nothing that would say otherwise. Because Israel is attacking Lebanese territory, and so therefore that triggers Lebanon's right of self-defense. Um, So Kung Fu Kenny says, at what point does an IOF soldier lose their protection as a civilian whilst off duty in the case of anti-colonial violence struggle? If I remember correctly, Israeli civilians have the right to carry arms. How does this impact soldiers whilst off duty in the case where a colonized people were to take up arms against the colonizers whilst attempting to avoid committing war crimes? So for the purposes of targeting, there's two different kinds of targeting. Whether you are engaged in a war of resistance or not, it's the same. Okay, so this applies to interstate wars, to non-international conflicts, to wars of resistance. It's the same. And Changebox, thanks for following. Um, Generally, a combatant, like an active member on duty of the armed forces, is targetable anywhere where they are, even if they are on leave, even if they are sleeping, even if they are like sleeping in while on leave. They're still targetable. What they are not is um, not subject to the prohibitions of disproportionate and indiscriminate attacks. So if this soldier is next to sleeping in a place next to two kids, that doesn't mean you can shoot them just because he's a valid target. He may be a legitimate target, but he's not a valid target because it would be disproportionate to kill a soldier and then kill two children along with him when this soldier carries like basically no military advantage. The damage to civilians would be disproportionate. But combatants, soldiers, are targetable anywhere they are, as long as they are on duty, even if they are on leave. If they're off duty, if they're like a reservist or something, for example, then they are not targetable because they are combatants. They are not targetable at any time, at all times. But when say a settler, a violent settler, the kind of the ones that operates in the West Bank, picks up a weapon and participates in the hostilities in defense of the Israeli efforts to colonize the West Bank, while that participation is taking place, that settler can be also attacked. And if that settler has a permanent combat function within any kind of like armed group in the settler community, then they would also be a valid target. So this applies to all wars, the same for everyone. This is why the um, the issue of direct participation in hostilities is so important and so under discussed. All combatants are legitimate targets anywhere they are. That doesn't mean that they are valid targets. And every person who directly participates in hostilities is also a legitimate target. That doesn't mean that they're valid targets at all times, but they're legitimate targets. Um, and depending on whether they are participating in hostilities or not. So essentially, to your question, if you have an Israeli soldier on leave, he is targetable at all times as long as he's in the service. Once he redeploys to civilian life, he isn't the target unless he picks up a weapon and starts attacking Palestinians. That's it. Um, Let me see what else. Rosaba tolerance. How legal is targeting off-duty IDF soldiers or usually in active reserves? Can it be legal since they have continuous combat function, or is it only legal when they are actively participating in hostilities? Um. Okay, so again, this is something that applies on every conflict. Okay, I'm not making a specific comment about the IDF, or about Hamas or Hezbollah. But what I will say is, if they are in reserve, then they're not valid targets. Um, it can be legal if they are civilians who have a continuous combat function in an armed group, like not in the armed forces, but in a separate armed group, or if they are directly participating in hostilities at the time of targeting. Idiot Drone says October 7th was basically a patriotic act of resistance for the sake of rightful independence and fully justified. No, I don't think that at all. I don't think October 7th advances the cause of decolonization, and the fact I think it I mean it led to 40,000 people, or at this point I think it's like 118,000 people estimated dead. So no, I don't think it was a patriotic act of resistance. You can have in the context of an occupation, any occupation, you can have, like, say, a Ukrainian resistance fighter commits a war crime. That war crime isn't justified because it was committed in the course of a act of resistance. Um, Changebox says that the answer was very satisfying. Oh, great, thanks. um, I think people were fighting on the chat. I thought it was questions for me. Um, okay. Um, okay. So we are an hour and 50 minutes in. Um, I'm wondering if anyone else has any other questions that you want me to ask. If not, what I'll do is I wanted to tell you also to like make it clear to you that I'm not talking crazy here. I'm not inventing this, and so I wanted to take advantage of the fact that some friends of mine have a podcast. Oh, I'm glad, Biskowicz, that you find it really interesting because I was worried that we were like disagreeing too much. Same with Steve. Like I worried that we were disagreeing too much, but I think it's important to have these disagreements. Um, oh no, Magical Ferals, don't worry. I mean, you can engage on the chat. I just won't engage with it. You can have your own thing in the chat. That's fine. Um, so so yeah, there was a podcast in with a group of friends of mine who's really good. I really recommend it to you. It's called Call to the Bar, where basically it's Douglas Guilfoyle, who's a professor at the University of New South Wales, um, and Dina Tuvala and Tamsin Page, who are amazing scholars, and they were discussing this. And so there's a section of that podcast that is really interesting by Douglas Guilfoyle, who's a very doctrinal guy. Very like he's not I wouldn't define him as a radical, critical, you know, um, uh, I don't know, lawyer or anything. He's a very doctrinal guy. He basically follows legal procedure, legal process to come to conclusions. And he has a 3-minute intervention in that podcast that I think is very interesting. I'm going to show it to you. I'm going to share it with you so that you can listen to it and see that like I'm not the only one with these ideas. So I think that can prompt a little discussion after that, and then we can start wrapping it up. Okay, so I'm going to show you the podcast here. We're going to listen to 3 minutes of it. So again, this is Douglas Guilfoyle. This is Douglas. Is a professor at the University of New South Wales in Canberra, Australia. And here he goes. Let me see if you hear audio, okay? You can't hear audio, can you? I did not think this through.
State, the rules of self-defense, and jus in bello, the rules that conduct, the rules that apply to the conduct of operations at a tactical level. On the jus ad bello, a significant question since September 11 has been, when do you get to use force against the territory of another state if you are subjected to an attack by a non-state armed group? So the UN Charter, Article 51, self-defense, is obviously set up on the basis of governing a system of relations between states. It does not obviously or directly contemplate non-state armed groups. I'm sure some historian of the Charter will email me tomorrow and tell me that's totally wrong, but that on its face, Article 51 binds states. Now, what we did have after the terrorist incidents of September 11, 2001 was Security Council Resolution 1368, which invoked ideas of collective self-defense following that terrorist attack on the United States. So it is reasonable to say, on the basis of that and other practice, such as NATO invoking Article 5, that a fairly substantial group of states believe that you can be subject to an armed attack by a non-state armed group. That's step one. Now, you have a right to self-defense if an armed attack occurs. That's step two. So at least in theory, I have no problem with the idea that Israelis can formally claim self-defense following an armed attack by Hezbollah. The critical step that I am still not convinced of is step three. That allows you to take action in another state's territory if the non-state armed group in question isn't a proxy force of that state, right? That, to my mind, remains the unresolved question. Now, obviously, the United States, Israel, the UK, Australia, and a number of others have pioneered the kind of unable and unwilling doctrine. That is, if the territorial state is unable and unwilling to shut down the attack by the non-state armed group, we should be able to exercise self-defense against the territory of the unwitting host state. Now, the problem with that thesis is it has always been supported only by a very limited number of states, and international law is a numbers game, right? It's a consensus-based system. You don't get to make rules just amongst a little club of states unless they only bind those states, right? You can't make up rules with your friends and then impose them on others. That's not how the system works. And the killer for me has always been to kind of ask, anytime these arguments are made, all right, there's a limited number of states in the world that are capable of projecting force against their neighbors. The vast majority have very limited means to do so. Why would the vast majority of states accept that it is in their interests to have such a doctrine, right? When they are more likely to be the ones invaded than doing the invading. There is no rational reason the majority of existing states would support an unable or unwilling doctrine. So as far as I'm concerned, you do not have a right of self-defense against a non-state armed group in another state's territory. Now, the pushback then will be, well, you're asking a state to sit on its hands. My answer to that would be no, there are very limited exceptions in the law that will allow you to deal with these situations. And the most obvious one for me is necessity. Now, this is probably a very long way of making the same point you guys have just made. Now, I do not think anyone coming to these things for the first time can just Google it later. I do not think the Caroline incident is a good statement of the law of self-defense. I do think it's a good statement of the law of necessity. And in the Caroline incident, the formula adopted was where you have a necessity of self-defense, instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. under a circumstance where you can see the non-state armed group is about to strike you again, and you have a clear moment to act, then I think under the doctrine of necessity, you could strike at a non-state armed group in another state's territory. You cannot conduct a wide-scale indefinite ground campaign unless you can get a United Nations Security Council Chapter 7 resolution, right? Or unless the territorial state invites you in to deal with the problem. Otherwise, all you've got is necessity. And I actually think that given that the law on the use of force has been meant to encourage self-restraint since the end of the Second World War, I don't regard that as problematic. Now, I would regard that as a purely formalist analysis, but I think I might land in the same place as you guys, even if I've come a longer way round the house.
And come on.
Okay, so first of all, I just want to say, Changebox, thank you so much for gifting all those subscriptions. I really appreciate it. You should definitely join the Discord group because we have a special place for sub gifters over there. And Pet Malfec, thank you for following the channel. Oh, and also Kung Fu Kevin as well. Thanks for following. Thanks, Changebox. I mean, subscriptions do really help the channel because it allows me to invest more in the channel, and so like get like fun emotes or like get like more alerts. So it really does help. I really appreciate it. Um, what I would say is what Douglas is saying there, and again, I highly respect Douglas as a scholar, as an academic, but we tend to be in like different theoretical frameworks. I tend to operate more from a post-colonial critical perspective. He's more of a doctrinal formalist kind of guy. I don't know if formalist, but like more like a black letter law kind of guy. Um, and even from these two very different approaches, we basically have very similar views. We both accept that there is no self-defense against non-state actors, and that there are very limited exceptions to that, particularly based on necessity. Um, and so, yeah, I just wanted to share this because I felt I'm going to talk about this, and people are going to say, "Oh, that's just because you're this like radical, lefty, um, pro-Palestine crazy guy, and you're making this up." So I thought I'd share Douglas, who isn't that. um, he's um, he's a very doctrinal guy, to show you like there's relatively broad consensus on academia that what I'm saying is true. And you can also see the same kind of arguments by Adil Haq in this article that I mentioned earlier, Self-Defense Against Self-Defense in Syria and Beyond. He's a professor at Rutgers. So I think I'm in pretty good company when I tell you the things that I'm telling you. So hopefully you believe me that I did not just make all of this up. Um, so yeah. Oh, and Changebox, thank you so much for your nice words. I really appreciate your support as well. Um, okay, so Biskowicz, I'm glad that you find these sources interesting. Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of discussion in the media right now that is based on talking points and on commonplace arguments, like that whole discussion about comparing this to the Nazis, that are, I mean, are relatively easy to break down and like, but they're so prevalent that no one really um challenges them. So hopefully by sharing other kind of content and other like academic content and people from like, I don't know, Cornell and sorry, Rutgers and like University of New South Wales and me being in London, you can see that the discussion among scholars of international law is quite different from the discussion you see in the media. We uh, we don't seem to have the same kind of like huge disagreement as the media does as to self-defense. We generally agree. We disagree here and there, but generally agree on this. So yeah, hopefully exposing yourself to this kind of like world is useful. Um, hey Kung Fu Kenny, yeah, I am gonna end the stream soon because we are 2 hours. um, so wait, what happened, Cheese Steve? Cheese Steve said something. Um, Oh no, it's Changebox. Sorry, it's not Cheese Thief. Yeah, but I am gonna end this soon. Um, yeah, I am wrapping up. We're at 2 hours exactly. Um, oh, Cheese Thief, thanks for redeeming a celebration. And Idiot Drone, thanks for following. Okay, guys. I will wrap it up here. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for spending your weekend with me. And don't forget, Macro Psycho, thanks for following. And oh, Changefox, thanks for another subscription gift. Um, yeah, so stay tuned, and if you want to watch me play Baldur's Gate 3, join me on Thursday. Other than that, thank you so much. Oh, and Cheese Steve, thanks for the on-screen celebration again. Other than that, thank you for spending time with me. Thank you for supporting the channel. And I will see you on Thursday. Thank you. I'm gonna end the stream now. And yeah, see you at Discord. Bye.